Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's live chat. My name is Jess Fanzo. I'm your professor this week. I hope you've been enjoying the sessions and the videos, and it's stimulating a lot of thought and conversation. I'm hoping to get to the discussion board this weekend, so please check back if you've put in a comment or a question, and I'll try to respond to those over the weekend. But for now, we're here together, so let's start having a conversation. So I think we had one person talk about how in London she's been learning a bit more about food waste and food compost from some of her neighbors who predominantly, I think it was a Muslim neighborhood. It's really interesting when we live in a multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious communities, and you do learn different things about different cuisines, the way people purchase food, what kind of foods are important for them, how they handle food, their practices around disposal of food. And so it was great to hear the student talk about what she's learning from living in a Muslim neighborhood about food waste. And some of the good practices that are happening within that community. So I think there's a lot to learn from other cultures and traditions. And some of us have the pleasure of being able to live in very multi-ethnic neighborhoods and get to experience that. Another comment that came in, why is nutrition so important intergenerationally? And I think from the videos you've seen that in states of poor nutrition, when you have a mom who is undernourished and she herself gives birth to a low birth weight baby, and that little girl doesn't get the nutrition that she needs, she has a tendency, and the trends are, to not be able to have academic achievement. She tends to drop out of school, marry early, get pregnant early, and that cycle continues. And that's a very hard cycle to break. We also have situations and drivers across the food system that make that cycle even more difficult to break. Right now, we're seeing issues of conflict that have led to famine in South Sudan and Somalia. And as we know, in South Sudan, the war's been going on for a long time, and this has now led to this unprecedented situation in which we have massive famine. And it's very hard for a country to get out of that cycle when they're hit with war and famine and high risk of mortality for their children and the women that are trying to stay safe. So these kind of issues are huge. So it's really important when we think about food systems and thinking about ultimate outcomes, that nutrition and health is one of the major outcomes that we need to improve on. Another question that came in is on the new technologies of vertical farming and automation of farming to better manage resources, labor, water, and soil. This is a really interesting area, one that I'm not as familiar with. I don't really work, we're seeing a lot of this in urban places, for example, these vertical farms. And actually some have been pioneered at Columbia University in New York, where the SDG Academy sits. I think it's an interesting area. I think it's expensive at the moment. I think it could potentially be very important in feeding urban populations. I teach another class called Rural Development, and yesterday we were talking about urban agriculture. And I think at the moment, urban agriculture is really important in providing, filling nutrient gaps, growing of microgreens and lettuces and some fruits and vegetables and herbs. The question remains is, can we really feed the world with urban agriculture and some of these new technologies the vertical farming, the rooftop farming that can use some of the new natural resource saving technology. And I think that the jury's out on what that would look like, and where and how and who would participate in urban farming. I think it's an interesting space that we need to watch, and clearly we're going to need more evidence to look at impacts and cost effectiveness, etc. So another question that just came in is around urbanization. And as you all know, and as you're learning in the class, urbanization is one of the big drivers, exogenous drivers across the food system, but it's going to impact every system, right? Health systems, environment systems, financial systems. People are leaving rural areas and moving to urban centers, mega cities, moderate mega cities. And this trend won't stop. There's a lot of job opportunities in urban places. And obviously, with urbanization, we also tied to that closely is globalization and trade. And they're bringing a lot of diversity to diets, but they're also bringing a lot of unhealthy diet components like processed and packaged foods, more unhealthy street foods, eating out more, sedentary lifestyle. Here I am sitting right now on my computer, not moving around at all. So I think with urbanization comes great opportunity for income generation, prosperity, more access to different foods, but with that also unhealthy foods. So I think there's positives and negatives, but clearly we know that through the nutrition transition, as people urbanize, we're seeing that countries get fatter, right? More obese. And that's a general trend. And we really see that across all countries. There's really no country that's been able to mitigate that. So what do we do in that situation? How can we make urban food environments healthier, making markets healthier, having more farmers markets, ensuring corner stores are providing healthy, affordable foods, solving food desert issues where there's no markets to be had in urban centers, addressing food swamps where there's a lot of food, but it's all unhealthy food, fast food. How do we start to deal with that? How do we incentivize retail, and how do we get food and beverage industry to start thinking about these issues with urbanization? And the fatty, salty street food is really an interesting area. Now there's an interesting program in Singapore looking at the healthy street vendors, incentivizing them to provide healthy foods by giving them a tax break. So it's an interesting program that's going on in Singapore, where street food's really popular and delicious. What are some of the ways to measure the health of a market or food environment? Is that different for urban versus rural areas? This is a fantastic question. So the food environment, as you were learning this week, is very distinct. It's part of the food system. It's the place where consumers engage with the food system. And so you can look at things like physical access to those food environments. How close are you to that food environment? Do you have to get into a car? Can you walk? So there's a lot of work looking at distance using GPS and GIS technology on how far away are markets from people. Another thing you can look at is food affordability. What's the cost of food? And what are people willing to pay? So you can measure that. What are people willing to pay for healthy food? Some people can't afford a lot and are willing to pay extra costs for healthy foods or organic foods or local foods or certified foods like fair trade foods. Another thing you can look at is promotion and information. What kind of information is out there, and what's the impact of that information? mass media campaigns, dietary guidelines, labeling. How effective are these promotion and information pieces of the food environment? You can look at placement of food in stores. Where's food placed? Is it a perverse system in which all the healthy foods are up as you're standing in line at the cash register? You always see the chocolate bars while you're queuing in line. And last, the last piece of the food environment, which you can keep track of and measure, is the composition, safety, and quality of food. Looking at safety guidelines, looking at whether or not there's ingredient lists, what's in those ingredients. So there's lots of places where you can look at and measure the food environment. Now, there's a lot of data gaps in understanding the food environment. This is really a new space. It's a new area of science. And even people are still debating on the definition of what a food environment is. So it's an interesting area, and why I said it's such a great question is that a lot of people are looking at how do you measure food environments and trying to understand the big data gaps and what those food environments look like. One of the complexity is that there's so many different kinds of food environments. Macro food environments, micro food environments, mobile, immobile, lots of places to acquire food. Restaurants, supermarkets, corner stores. So it's not an easy task to try to measure those food environments because they're all so diverse. And obviously in urban and rural places, you're gonna have different types of food environments. In rural places, the food environments are probably more limited. You've got kiosks where you can buy a few different things, soap and some food and maybe some seeds. You have a lot of informal markets, wet markets and dry markets. But when you get into the urban environment, there's a lot of other food environments that come into play. Different types of restaurants from upscale to fast food. You've got a lot of different kind of corner stores. You've got supermarkets, high-end markets, discount markets. So it gets more complex when you start to look in the urban space. So another question that just came in was, how can we deal with matters of culture in relation to our dietary needs? Again, another fantastic question. Our culture, our traditions, our social norms play such an important role. And when we talk about the food environment, we often think of it as this external thing. But we know that when we look at food, we decide whether or not we're going to buy it or eat it. We prepare it, we cook it, we purchase it. All of these elements, we bring with us our culture in making those decisions, our personal food environment, not to that external food environment in which we acquire food. And culture matters a lot. Food is very much central to our lives. Almost every special occasion or cultural tradition or religious tradition has food centered around it. It's a place for us to socialize and gather and share with each other our backgrounds. And so culture really does drive our decisions and our preferences of what types of foods we want to eat and which foods we choose to eat. And I would say that, we often talk a lot about the importance of conserving and preserving culture. And that is really important. But there are situations in which social norms can actually be negative, can be detrimental of, for example, certain food taboos where you restrict food because of some cultural belief. Sometimes this can be really detrimental from a nutrition and health perspective. So while it's important in conserving culture, we have a lot of indigenous peoples in the world, and culture and tradition is incredibly important, and there are custodians and stewards of that. We also have to remember, though, that sometimes culture can set us back in making progress. So I think there's positives and negatives with culture, but no matter what, it definitely drives how we live our lives and the kind of food we eat. And with that is another question that talks about changing consumer behavior in terms of using food to ensure food security. Not sure exactly what that means, but this is sort of the holy grail for nutrition, is how do you change consumer behavior to ensure that people consume healthier foods? This is tough. But behavior is malleable. You can change it. We've looked at dietary trends over time, and people's diets have changed. And a question earlier, I had said in one of the lectures that supply answers to demand. And it's true, but that person criticized that and said that's a naive way of thinking, because that's right, in that we as individuals can change our behavior to something, and supply will answer to demand. There's lots of examples of that. But we also know that the supply side can formulate our behaviors, and we know that through certain subsidies that have gone through. We know that from certain trade policies. We know that from certain agriculture production systems have dominated the types of foods that we eat. But on the other hand, when we think about shifts in diets, we know right now there's big shifts in the grains that people are choosing. In the West, people are eating lots of quinoa. A decade ago, no one even heard of quinoa. So people are shifting from eating wheat to quinoa in a lot of the United States and in Europe. That's a huge shift. In West Africa, people are consuming rice, not so much sorghum and millet now. In China, people are moving from rice to wheat. So we're seeing these shifts, and people have preferences because it's a status thing, or they like the taste, or they like the nutritional value. They like the convenience factor. So people's behaviors change, and so do dietary patterns. So another question that just came in is, what do you think about food policy for Indigenous people? I hope I'm saying this right, the Mentawai Island in Indonesia, there is a shift from local food to rice. And this is exactly what I was getting to, is that there's preferences and of what people want to consume. This is really common, where you're seeing pressure to shift from local foods to what's considered maybe higher status foods or wealthy foods. I used to work at an organization called Bioversity. It's one of the CGIARs. And a lot of the work that we do is trying to understand, how do you conserve and preserve these traditional diets and traditional foods, and ensure that neglected and underutilized species can become mainstreamed. But this is really a tough thing. You know, more and more we see people moving towards certain crops, certain foods. Rice, wheat, maize are the predominant grains that people like to consume. And a lot of this, of course, now coming back to the demand-supply issue, supply is growing a lot of those three crops. But also, people like the taste of rice. It tastes good. It has a status to it. And so there's a lot of work going on of how do you try to conserve these neglected, underutilized species, or NUS. And how do you ensure that those that do grow these neglected and underutilized species maintain their own diet? So quinoa is an example of that, in which it was a neglected and underutilized species, and it became very popular in the West, and the Andean farmers, it became a cash crop for them, something that was not traditionally consumed. And a study just came out last year showing that while it was thought that potentially quinoa becoming a cash crop was detrimental, it turns out that it actually boosted the farmers there. Whether or not they're consuming the quinoa still as part of their traditional diet is an interesting question that I don't think is so clear yet. How can we deal with food contamination due to inappropriate food storage from a student that sees this in Rwanda? Okay. Yeah, so this is a great question. So the whole food safety issue. Um, Obviously, in places where I sit in Washington, D.C., we do get outbreaks of food safety from foodborne or waterborne or zoonotic diseases. And this is a huge issue. But it's highly regulated, and we're dealing with long value chains in which food moving from production to consumption has gone through appropriate distribution, transport, storage, packaging, and processing, usually involving cold chain storage and then highly regulated through multiple steps through that long value chain. Now, obviously, in places where you don't have that long value chain, or in places where there's a limited capacity on cold chain storage, this becomes an issue. So things like fruits and vegetables and animal source foods, which are very perishable, they need that cold chain storage. So if you don't have that, you're really, really putting the food at risk for loss, but also food safety issues. So I think there's a lot of technologies underway, not only on low resource setting cold chain storage, but on better packaging and processing. Tetra Pak and ultra pasteurized milk has been revolutionary, and I'm sure in Rwanda they get the ultra pasteurized milk in the Tetra Pak that sits on a shelf, not in a refrigerator. That's been transformative for a lot of lower income settings to be able to access milk. So while it's not fresh milk right out of the cow, it's a good approach for at least getting a nutrient-rich source of food that's safe to the shelves of markets. So there's lots of technology going on across the value chain of better distribution, processing, and packaging to improve food safety. Another big issue in food safety is aflatoxin, which maize, peanuts, and other important crops are contaminated with this mycotoxin or aflatoxin. And there's some technology coming out, AflaSafe, or better storage post-harvest that can mitigate against aflatoxin. We also need better diagnostics, though, on-the-spot surveillance and diagnostics, because sometimes we catch these food safety issues too late and there's high mortality. So we need better surveillance systems on the field and along the value chain to try to catch issues of food safety concerns as they go. We obviously have bigger issues with zoonotic diseases that are coming down the pike with antibiotic resistance and cross-contamination from animal to human diseases, and this is a great concern. And while there's a lot of work going on, like avian flu, if you all remember, which still continues, we're not addressing that very systematically, and it's a pretty scary thing, actually. With the antibiotic resistance, we'll potentially see more of these issues, as well as with climate change, of this different pathogen patterns that we're going to see in the future. So this is something that we're going to have to deal with. And hopefully the new head of the World Health Organization, whoever that is, this will be something that they deal with squarely, because it's very high on the agenda. The antimicrobial resistance was at the UN General Assembly discussions, I think it was 2 years ago now. So it's high on the agenda, but we need to take more action in this space. The other issue with food contamination and food safety is agriculture practices. We know, and we're learning more and more, that industrial agriculture, the use of certain pesticides and fertilizers and herbicides not used appropriately in excess puts us at risk from a health perspective. So we need to be thinking about not only foodborne, waterborne, and zoonotic diseases, but also chemical contamination from food. So that's a whole nother area of food safety. Another question that came in, so we spoke about different grains. We have talked about dietary differences in urban and rural areas and how to have a healthy diet. How do we measure dietary diversity? So dietary diversity can be measured. There's several different ways to measure dietary diversity. There's something called the Dietary Diversity Score that can be measured at the household or the individual level. There's actually a new Dietary Diversity Score for women. And this score is useful, and you can use it in the field in that you sit with a person and you ask them what they consumed over the last 24 hours. And they will list out the types of foods they ate. So it's a recall method. You then can calculate by food groups those list of foods and put them into different food groups. And you can see how many food groups that person had consumed for the day. And obviously, the higher number of food groups is a proxy for increased dietary diversity. So that's one way. Another way is a food frequency. So it's not just 24 hours, but you can actually ask someone the types of foods that they eat over a month. So how many days of the week did you eat maize? If they say every day, 7 days a week, then you can ask how many times per day, and they'll say twice a day. So you can get it to the frequency of how much people consume of different foods throughout a month. And this is a better picture of looking at over the longer term of what someone's dietary pattern is, as opposed to just asking them the day before. Because we eat different foods depending on the situation. If there's a wedding, or we have to go to work, or we're working in the field, what have you. Another measure of dietary diversity is for young children, which is critically important. We know that infant and young child feeding that is appropriate and nutritious can put a child on the right course for life. So along with exclusive breastfeeding, which there's plenty of measures of, there's also something called the minimum acceptable diet, or MAD. And that detects meal frequency of children 6 to 24 months of age, how many meals they ate in a day, as well as, again, the food groups. How many food groups did they consume in a day? And those two measures forms this index, or this minimum acceptable diet. Did they eat enough, and did they eat good quality? And that's a very good indicator, and that's collected by most of the demographic and health surveys now. Unfortunately, we know how important diet is. It's now the #1 risk factor for the global disease burden. But dietary diversity is not a sustainable development goal indicator, unfortunately. So we have really no global tracking mechanism for measuring diets. What is measured are the anthropometry indicators that we talked about in the lessons: stunting, wasting, childhood obesity. Adult obesity is not tracked as an SDG, surprisingly. So that's the dietary diversity. So another question coming in is, if we use sustainable intensification, which Occam Doberman was probably speaking about, and move away from extensive organic systems, is there any evidence that this will lead to a further reduction of nutritious foods? It's an interesting question. I think that the question depends. My worry is that we know that an interesting paper just came out by a guy named Mario Herrero in the Lancet Planetary Health Journal, which is a new Lancet subjournal. And he shows that smallholder farms and mixed farms still are producing a lot of the world's nutrients. So the amount of nutrients that those landscapes produce is over 60% of the world's nutrients, as opposed to these larger scale farms. So to me, the intensification versus organic, that I'm less clear about. The organic systems can be monoculture. But to me, what's interesting is the mixed landscape systems, having livestock, having different crops, having fruit trees, growing lots of different varieties of foods. My worry is that we're moving away from that. So who is going to produce the world's nutrients? Or are we all going to be growing corn and soy? That's my concern. So these mixed smallholder systems are actually really important. And there's pressure, though, as all of you know, of consolidation of land, rural outmigration. It's hard to be a smallholder farmer. It's hard to make a livelihood and a living doing that. So who's going to produce our nutrients? Are we going to have to always add them back into food and fortify our food to get the nutrients? That's my biggest worry. So someone asked about applying systems thinking or dynamic modeling within our agriculture, food, and beverage industry. I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but inherently, if we start to think about agriculture, food, if we think about agriculture and food and nutrition and the stakeholders and their roles within that, you inherently get into a systems approach when you start to think about that, the negative feedback loops and the dynamism of the system. I think we're in a stage now where we're dealing with systems thinking across all disciplines, whether you're in health sector or you're in governance, or if you're in climate or environment, we have to think in systems. And I think a lot of the younger generation, you all already think in systems. You have these great social networks where you're thinking very dynamically about systems. It's harder for us old folk to be thinking about systems. We're trained very narrowly in one discipline. But I think now in nutrition particularly, you need to be thinking about the multi-sectoral, multi-discipline, multi-system approach to things. And thinking in this way, it's complex, right? It's not complicated, but it's complex. And I think we need to embrace that complexity. And, in a lot of the diagrams I was showing in the different classes, there's lots of arrows and boxes, and I think we need to understand those arrows, how things flow and move and positively and negatively impact each other. We quickly get very academic when we start thinking about this, but I think it's important because a lot of the solutions that we'll need to improve the food system are going to have to be systems-based solutions. Okay, so the next question, as today's World Health Day, I didn't know that. Every day is something else, right? I think yesterday was World Mental Health Day, right? Or maybe that's today. Can health supplements effectively address micronutrient deficiencies minus a huge diet shift? Okay, so there's definitely lots of different tools in the toolbox to address micronutrient deficiencies. Clearly, supplements are important and have been long instituted. We have vitamin A supplementation. We have iron for children under 5. We've got iron and folic acid supplementation for pregnant women. We have zinc being treated for diarrhea. So these are important, and they have filled a gap, an important gap. We also have other tools like biofortification, single nutrient biofortified crops like orange flesh sweet potato and fortified rice. We have fortification of food post-harvest, so fortification of flour, fortification of oil, fortification of milk. All of these are important, particularly in places where working on the diversity of the diet and getting those value chains to work and to move and to deliver food and make it accessible. In places where that is very dismal, supplements, fortification can be an effective tool. We need to be thinking, though, of course, about the dietary approach. How do we ensure that people get a whole diet that's diverse and of high quality? because we don't want people eating pills, powders, and pastes the rest of our life. But supplements can play a really important role in treating micronutrient deficiency. Where I am at Johns Hopkins, Al Summer was pioneering in vitamin A for children under 5, and he did a lot of that work in Nepal, where he saw a lot of vitamin A deficiency, and he made an important contribution to public health. Another question, does the shift from traditional food to the recommended staple food have a negative impact in terms of health concerns? I think, it depends on what the traditional food is. I think the shift to rice in a lot of places, moving away from maybe more nutrient-rich foods like sorghum and millet. Sorghum and millet are actually high in protein, much higher than cassava and rice, and even higher than maize. So that shift is not a healthy shift. I think shifting from whole grains to starchy processed white bread is not a great shift. I'm Italian and I love Italian white bread. It's probably going to be the death of me, but that's not exactly healthy. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who's from Japan, and I said, would you ever eat brown rice with sushi? And he said, absolutely not. So you could go back to a more traditional grain or a more nutritious variety of that grain, but for some, culture tells you not to do that. So I think it depends on what the shift was, what that traditional food was. In Timor-Leste, where I work a lot, a traditional food was cassava, and they're shifting to rice. There's no nutrition superiority in that shift. Cassava is starchy, low in protein. Rice is starchy, low in protein. So there's no health concern in that shift. What's more of a concern is the recent trends of instant noodles. Deep fried instant noodles with the high salt and MSG intake. So that's kind of one of these shifts where you see, something going for rice not being so healthy, but now a really highly processed packaged food. And why are people consuming that? Well, it's cheap. It actually tastes pretty good. It's salty. And it's really easy to cook. It takes 3 minutes. So how do you get those kind of foods healthier? We're seeing a lot of that. So that shift from cassava to instant noodles, for example, is not a great shift. And this will be my last question, and I wish I could hear and see you all and we had a more face-to-face, but I hope you've all enjoyed this. So let me take this last question. The food industry reduces our options, choices to eat a healthy diet. How do we work with industry to improve nutrition, create better regulation where needed, and empower consumers to make better choices? This is the ultimate question of how do we deal with industry? It's tough. We know that industry's bottom line is economic growth and profit. And how can we strike that balance of economic growth and nutrition benefits? This is the golden question that everyone's trying to figure out. We also know that industry has a very powerful voice, more powerful than consumers. They're shaping food systems and environments. So what do we do? I think there's lots of options. There's the state regulation. We're seeing now taxes on certain foods like sugar sweetened beverages, which really benefits no one. And if you do consume a lot of soda, my best suggestion for you of the entire week is to just stop drinking soda for many reasons, not only health-wise, but politically. If you want to take control of something, stop drinking soda. If you want to take control of industry's power. Taxing, so that can work. Subsidies can work. Healthy subsidies can work. So that's on the state side. On the industry side, I think we are no longer in a situation where we can decide to not engage with industry. We have to engage with them. And how do we work with them to produce healthier options, reformulations of foods that are tasty? Using technology in that way could be important. Working with industry to have double duties around climate smart business and nutrition smart business. I think a lot of food industry and beverage industries are concerned about climate change and what it's going to do to their bottom line. So how can we work with industry to think about double duty mitigation on climate and nutrition? I think there's also information and consumer education and the power of education and what that can mean in creating new demands. And we do see that a lot. There's been a lot of demand for different foods coming from different places. And the industry responds to that. They respond to demand. Whether people disagree with me or not, there's lots of evidence to suggest that they do. And they're always on the lookout for how demand shifts. So I think that, you know, there's three levels. There's state regulation. There's working with industry on reformulation, so they see benefits of producing healthy foods, and then the consumer power. Brazil, a lot of the work that they've done on consumer demand and civil society movements have been incredibly powerful in shaping how the food system looks there. So Brazil's a great learning lesson for all of us. So thank you all very much. It's been fun, although I can't see you or hear you. I will respond to some of the discussion questions and over the weekend, so please check back. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the class. Keep following next week and the week after. It'll be fun. And if any of you want to reach out to me, just Google Jessica Fanzo, Johns Hopkins, and you can find me, and I'm happy to engage with you on email or Skype, wherever you are. Have a great weekend, everybody.